Hello and welcome to The Understanding. I'm Matthew Carozzo, Director of Brand and Communication at Unbound. Recently I was in London to sit down with Azeem Azhar, the award-winning entrepreneur, analyst and journalist. Over the next half hour and a bit we discuss why machine learning is different than what's come before, how to compete with the big four technology firms, the ethics of their increasingly powerful platforms, and what to keep an eye out for in 2018 and beyond.
So you're increasingly known for your email newsletter, The Exponential View, but going back a bit before that, what's your background? Where did you come from?
Yeah, it's something of a medley. I started my career as a journalist. I covered the tech business for The Guardian and The Economist at the time of the running up to the internet boom, 97 through to 99, and in fact I covered the Netscape IPO, if you can remember what Netscape was. And then I moved over and I've spent the bulk of my career in the startup and venture ecosystem, working for a number of small tech companies. Some have done quite well and some haven't done so well, and building my own startups, the most recent of which looked at how people behaved on Twitter, applied a bunch of machine learning. It was acquired a couple of years ago, and then I moved and worked with the acquirer and did a couple of other things. But having spent 7 years building a company, and you focus very narrowly, I decided that I wanted to go a little bit broader, and that's when I started to write Exponential View.
Okay, and that goes out on a weekly basis, and tell us a bit about what it is and how much effort and how much time does it take you?
Well, Exponential View is really a labor of love. It's a weekly newsletter that covers technology and the range of technologies that I think are going to really make a difference over the coming few years. So things like artificial intelligence and blockchain, gene technologies, clean tech. And the lens that I take, it comes out of a sort of CP Snow 2 cultures, which is that for people who are technologists, I want them to be able to understand the political and economic and philosophical, ethical dimensions of what these changes mean. And for people who come from the arts, I want them to understand those changes in the context of the technologies and what's real and what isn't real. Now I have to say, it is a labor of love, so it didn't start that way. It started because I just wanted to externalize my thinking. But as it's gone on, it's got some fans, it now drives itself and has forced me to think about kind of the audience a little bit more and what is the set of questions I want them to think about.
So you've asserted elsewhere that we live in the age of technology.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean on a material basis, and why is it different than what's come before?
Well, I think if we look at the world's largest companies today, the biggest 7 or 8 are all tech companies. They're the so-called GAFAs and the Chinese internet giants like Tencent. That wasn't the case 10 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, the world's largest companies were this smorgasbord of sort of General Electric and Exxon and so on. And if you looked at those companies, they all made their money through ultimately the extraction of oil from the ground, or putting it into cars, or financing the purchase of those cars. And it was very much what we understood as the kind of modern industrial economy. And if you look at the largest companies today, they're all technology businesses. And actually the bulk of them have at their core that relationship between consumers, data, and machine learning. So that's it from an industrial standpoint. But you can also see that we live in the age of technology in the way in which we live our lives, right? We spend more of our time connected through systems that are mediated by technology. We spend more of our time using technology to extend our brains. We live our social lives increasingly, or a large part of them, through technology. And again, if you go back 10 or 15 years, that isn't how we used to do things. We would make an appointment to meet a friend at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night at the Crown and Goose pub, and we would be there about 10 minutes late.
With a printed out Google Maps instruction.
Well, 10 years ago, probably an A to Z even, like that's sort of ragged and stuck in the back of our bags. And those are the things that have really changed. And so when we look out at what's going to matter now, it is going to be a set of things that are driven by these technologies.
So what's different about artificial intelligence or machine learning than the kinds of technologies that we were used to before?
I'm really glad you said the word machine learning there when you talked about AI, because I think within machine learning what we have is software or machines that learn from their experience, and they learn from their experience and they get better. And that is just a distinct class of machines. Our previous machines, whether it was the plough or the water wheel or the steam train, didn't do that. It also gives rise to a really particular industrial strategy, and that strategy is what I've called the lock-in loop. And essentially, imagine this situation. So you have a product, that product uses machine learning in it. So when you put that product out to market, as users use it, through their use, they feed the system data. And the system improves from that data and gets better, which will then make the product better and will mean more users will use it, giving you more data. And that becomes a virtuous circle, a lock-in loop, through which you will then have a better product than people who've built that product without machine learning. And if you've got a great business model, at the same time you're spitting out profits on the other side, which allows you to invest in new products, new ways of defending your position in the market. And so you get to this world where once you put machine learning into an industry and you effectively build products around it, it becomes very hard to compete unless you use machine learning. And we saw that happening with video games and sort of first-person shooters. It's obviously happened in web search, it's happened in mobile. I mean, if you think about Google's web search franchise, which is still growing, it is the ultimate lock-in loop. So much so that original insight where they did those sort of graph calculations to figure out reputation many years ago, drove usage, it drove revenues, it drove investment. Then Google was able to go out to publishers and say, look, your pages need to have this kind of structure in order to be indexed well by our website. And then off the back of that comes the advertising business, and of course now this enormous advertising company. The other business that has used the lock-in loop really effectively, of course, has been Facebook. But Facebook has got a couple of other things going for it, because it's got the machine learning lock-in loop, but also has a network effect lock-in loop because all my friends are there. And then if we look at new industries, the car industry is a great example, because cars are going to become computers on wheels, and genuinely just computers on wheels. And so the need to get training data is so paramount for these vehicles. And of course, that data in of itself will become a moat that prevents competitors coming in.
So we talked about GAFA and the large Chinese technology companies, and obviously they're all deploying machine learning across the board, which is helping them develop these lock-in loops. But doesn't that also mean that maybe now more than ever in the past decade, there's now a chance for new entrants to come in if they are able to adopt that kind of they could basically glide past the Big Four or the Big Ten. Do you think is that something that you've seen in your investing, or? Well,
there is always room for new entrants because we're seeing febrile startup activity all over the place, and we're seeing the typical cycles as well of valuations getting out of whack and then coming back into place. And I think the startup environment is pretty dynamic. The issue with having these large companies at the scale that they are is not just about whether they crowd out startup innovation, because an entrepreneur can always find a niche. I wouldn't go out and try to launch, by the way, a generalized friends network, right? As an entrepreneur, put that one down low in your list. But there's always room for entrepreneurs to find their particular niches. I think the issue with the GAFAs is that they are becoming so large that they are able to distort not just markets, but societies and political power. And that's the point at which we have to start to ask questions about how we deal with them.
And do you have an opinion about how we deal with them? Is that a matter of regulation, or?
Well, I think if we're going to deal with them, it is probably less a matter of regulation and more a matter of law and social agreement, because many of our regulations are already being adhered to by the GAFAs. And even if you think about monopoly and antitrust, a lot of our antitrust law is predicated on the idea that a monopolist raises prices to consumers. But of course, these products are free to consumers, and they're priced, by the way, the cost to the consumers is hidden somewhere in the externality, right? Whether it's addiction to social media, or whether it's having a non-functioning democracy. These are costs that we have to pay, but they're not costs that antitrust law looks at. And so that means that if we want to start to make changes, it's going to require activity, I suspect, on quite a lot of fronts, and you're starting to see that. So I think the arrival of something like GDPR in Europe, which is a regulation that essentially gives me new rights over my data and my privacy, is something that might start to open little chinks to change the narrative with those companies. But as I walk around and I talk to a wide variety of people, I sound like a sort of a lonely man in the street, wandering around talking to strange people. But when I talk to sort of people in the industry, whether I talk to left-leaning technologists or venture capitalists or analysts, there is a strong common thread, which is somehow these companies need to be regulated. They need to have their terms of reference adjusted so that they end up being more pro-social. And the thing is that we don't really have great models for this, because history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, and we can't really just go back to Microsoft or AT&T or Standard Oil and say this is what happened last time. I think we're going to need to do something slightly different.
So technologist and Wired founder Kevin Kelly once wrote that humans are the sex organs of technology. Is that something you're familiar with? Or?
Yeah, I'm familiar with Kevin and Kevin's phrase. He is a fantastic thinker, and I think if we go back to our relationship with technology, it is a really intimate one. Technology has changed us, allowing us to then change technology, and on we go. You just have to think about, when we started to first figure out how to use tools, our very first flints were only honed on one axis. And then a few thousand years, you start seeing people hone the flints in two axes. So they're getting more and more sophisticated, which requires kind of different kind of manipulations in the brain. Or if you look at the size of hominid brain volume, so how big is our skull, it was effectively kind of up to about 500 cubic centimeters until a couple of million years ago, where we started to harness fire. And we then see over a period of 1.5 million, our cranial capacity triple to 1,500 cubic centimeters. Right, that's kind of driven by fire, which allowed us to improve our calorie intake. Or we talk about how our mobile phones and pen and paper externalizes some of our thinking, but we've also externalized some of our digestion. So because we started to mash up tubers with these flints, we didn't need to do a lot of heavy processing of those sort of dense, starchy carbohydrates the way that bovines and monkeys have to do. So compared to other hominids, our lower intestines are, relatively speaking, smaller than the lower intestines of animals who haven't externalized that job to technology. So that's how technology changes us. And the question is, that's how we get changed by technology. And then the question is, why do we continue to improve technology? And that gets driven by very, very simple localized decisions. You know what? Sometimes it's just easier to figure out how to store the food rather than kill it every single day. And so we figure out clay urns and all those sorts of things. We make these decisions in a kind of intimate, localized way. And then the next thing we know, we are where we are, wondering if we're actually going to become machines or if machines are going to become us.
So there's a lot of debate about that with people talking about a Terminator endgame or the singularity. Do you see a difference between the idea of intelligence and consciousness? And is that perhaps where are we running off into a direction kind of anthropomorphizing these threats when maybe we shouldn't?
Well, I think we find ourselves at a really interesting time where it's almost like the tide has risen, right? There were things that only we did, and we were the center of the world. And starting with, Galileo, we suddenly realized that perhaps we're not the center of space, and then with Darwin, perhaps we're not the center of creation, and we still had discussions, very active discussions. I studied philosophy at university about the nature of consciousness and the nature of the self and the nature of dualism, and what neuroscience is starting to tell us is it's telling us that space that is unexplainable is deeper and deeper in us. I point to my head, maybe I should be pointing to my heart. Deeper and deeper in us than we thought 10 or 15 years ago. In other words, we're explaining so much more of it. We're explaining the neural correlates of consciousness. We're creating machines that can increasingly behave like humans. So no wonder we start to ask these questions about what it means. Is there a difference between intelligence and consciousness? I think manifestly there is. If you take a definition of intelligence as being the ability to pursue a wide range of strategies to achieve some kind of objective outcome, which would include changing that objective, right? Saying, I don't want to do this now, I want to do this, then I think increasingly we can see that there's a wide range of non-human intelligence and a wide range of artificial intelligences that we've created. If we think about consciousness, and I'm going to be on really slippery ground here, but we think about consciousness as our awareness of our own subjective experience, that is literally a hard problem. How does that come about? I don't think we've got a great model for arguing that any machine we've built has it, but I don't think we've necessarily got a good model for saying that machines can't ever have it. And I'm a little bit of a fan of this idea of consciousness emerging out of the complexity of a system and its ability to process information. It's called integrated information theory. It's sort of a bit like saying that everything's got consciousness and that, dumber things have less consciousness than more complex things. And if that is the case, then I can imagine us on a separate path to artificial intelligence evolving some kind of artificial consciousness.
So there's these huge challenges that come with these new technologies and as they get more advanced. What do you see as some of the key areas that we should be focused on? Where should our attention be?
Well, I think there are four things that I tend to think about. The first is that there does appear to be an increasing rate of change in a lot of different domains. The second is that we have a really strong focus on efficiency and effectiveness. The third is that as a result of some of those dynamics playing out, we seem to see a barbelling, a growth in inequality. And the final thing, which is another social dimension, is that there is also appears to be a growth in homophily, which is this idea that birds of a feather flock together.
Filter bubbles and the like.
Filter bubbles, yeah. So let's talk about the homophily one, because that's perhaps not so obvious. But we are so familiar with filter bubbles, and we're familiar with the idea that if you go on Twitter and you're sort of liberal or progressive, you won't see comments from people who have opposing points of view, and when you do, you won't be able to put up with them, so you'll start to shut them off, and the reverse is true. And one of the reasons why that happens is because we can now see lots of other opinions, and we can build communities that are not constrained by geography. And Lisbon, which is where Unbevel is based, is a great example of that, right? It's attracting lots of people who are not from Portugal, so they don't have that kind of Portuguese bacalhau eating ethic behind them, but they've come because of a shared set of values. And so there's homophily writ large. We see homophily as a kind of sorting process that happens in cities where people with generally similar points of view can afford to live in a particular area, and then people with different points of view start to live in different areas. And then even when you start to get people with different points of view living in similar areas, you start to see some of the frictions that perhaps in the UK made themselves known in the Brexit referendum. But the problem with homophily is something that arises as we increase mobility, as we increase people's ability to not be rooted to the spot where they were born. And I'm not sure if we realised whether this was going to be the case when we implemented things like more mobility, but it does seem to be very, very much the case. And that's why in the US and in the UK you see that your zip code matters an awful lot in determining and describing who you are. And I think that becomes an issue. And I'll give you a funny example that we came across, which was that there's some evidence that since the rise of online dating, and in particular Tinder, there's been a growth in the number of interracial marriages in the US. And the reason is that you're able to just meet people based on however you feel. We could rationalize it one way or another. But one thing that seems to be declining is the rate of inter-politics marriages. So that is Republicans marrying Democrats or Democrats marrying Republicans, because we are birds of a feather who want to flock together.
Kind of a world without shared consensus, right?
Well, so I think that's interesting, right? A world without shared consensus. So how do you go about...
Can we even have a society if we're all in our own little hyper-partisan boxes?
Well, I mean, think back to Margaret Thatcher's phrase, as she said many years ago, there's no such thing as society, there are only individuals. And that really comes back down to part of that neoliberal mind frame that really came to birth in the 70s. Companies only exist for profits, people only exist for their own self-advancement. And clearly you ask the question, we can't, but we also know that people still look for ways in which to cluster together and have shared experiences. And I think our experience right now with what's happening in, I can talk about UK politics and a little bit about US politics, because is that there isn't much of a shared overlap, and there is an increasing polarization, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case. Some of the factors that drove that are tied into the media business model and the business model of advertising and the business model of audiences, and they're also tied to political decisions to underinvest in things that generate social goods within society. And this isn't the fault of the internet and the fault of Facebook, although just a lot of things are. It's stuff that's been written about for many, many years. Robert Putnam with his book Bowling Alone, which was written 15 years ago and was about the fact that Americans are not as convivial and collegial as they used to be. So as an aside, your Instagram feed has just gone absolutely crazy, and proving your millennial qualifications, you immediately flipped over to it. What's up? I'm getting likes.
No. It's just
I am getting likes.
Slip of the thumb. Back to the questions.
Wait, we got a plug?
Yeah. Also, thanks for the plug. So what do you think of the power dynamics enabled by these technological shifts? It seems like more and more wealth and power is being concentrated into the hands of very few people. I mean, I guess, is that a good thing, or?
I think concentrated power is never a good thing. You really want to distribute it as far as you can. And what we have seen is, as you say, this sort of enormous power law effect, which means that very few people get a lot, and the people below them get a little bit less. And eventually, many of us live in the long tail. And it's what, in a way, the impact effect that Yuval Harari talks about when he talks about these sort of immortal godlike humans and a useless class, because a handful of people will accelerate away in their wealth and their access to amazing health and medicine and sort of experiences. And we see this replicated time and again. So if you look at Bitcoin, there are about 30 million Bitcoin addresses while we're interviewing this. About 2,000 of them, 2,500, have 10 million bucks or more Bitcoin. But 20 million of them have $100 or less. So there's a real power law there. It's not the old sort of Gaussian hump distribution that we're used to. But I think the dirty secret of this is that it's not really something that comes out as a result of technology. By the way, pharaonic Egypt was not exactly a fair, egalitarian place. But when we look at some of the agent-based modeling of economies and wealth, which is sort of work that some complexity scientists have done, you end up with a power law dynamic. You just do, and you can change your assumptions. You constantly end up with that dynamic until you start to implement some form of redistribution. And that redistribution, in general, the one that is most effective is it is a tax on wealth. Not a tax on income, not a tax on transactions, but a tax on how much you have at the end of each time period that is redistributed disproportionately to the people who have the least. And that is the only way that you can get a distribution of wealth that starts to approach fairness. And it's not even the sort of mythical Gini of zero where we all have the same amount, but it's getting kind of better than that. Now, the trouble that we have is that that's not how tax systems work in most countries, and in fact we're going the other way in many countries. So the Americans are taking aim at the inheritance tax and death taxes, which is actually the most efficient way to avoid equality kind of spiraling out. Now, does technology make that process faster? Well, yes, it's made everything faster because we can move money around the globe much more quickly. You can you can move your talent if your talent is in demand, and so that sort of accelerates this process that is always happening underneath. So it's definitely an issue. It's an issue that's made sort of significantly worse with what we can now do with this sort of global set of technologies that we have in place. One thing that people talk about is about the need to have some kind of UBI, universal basic income, the idea that there are certain classes of goods that we should provide as a social good in the same way that we provide policing and we provide parks. I find UBI quite interesting. I'm sort of not sure what the big fuss is on either side of the argument, and certainly not sure what the haters' view of UBI is, other than it's a mechanism for redistribution, right? So fundamentally, I think the question seems to be, do we want to have a society where people can participate for the benefit of the whole of society, including ourselves? And do we think that things like inequality are problematic from an economic perspective? And inequality seems to be problematic from an economic perspective because what it tends to do is it tends to take people out of creative, productive environments into a sort of maintenance and sustaining mode. And it's often the case that societies that are very unequal tend to grow less fast than societies that are more equal. And that's one issue. So one issue is just about thinking about these things in terms of if we have such a thing as society, we often ask the state or whatever's going to replace the state to fill in the gaps, the things that you and I, private contract, won't ever manage. So cleaning the street, making sure there's an emergency ambulance available, the police, and figuring out climate change. And in my sort of cod economist's way of thinking about things like inequality and equal access to participation is very important because those things are not being provided through the market mechanism. And I think there's enough work that's been done by even the sort of the MIT Media Lab, which famously put early versions of the so-called $100 PC in Kenyan villages and that barely had electricity, and found that the kids were programming these things within 2 days. Right? It was all about their access and their ability to participate. But I think the thing that's very hard about all of this, ultimately, which people may not want to admit, is that whenever you redistribute power, you have to take it from someone and give it to some other people. It's as true as history that people don't want to often give that up.
So a lot of our conversation today is talked about the kind of the ethical considerations of this technology. What else is there that we should kind of keep in mind?
Well, I think machine learning in particular is such a powerful technology. It is not value neutral like all other technologies, and what that means is that it comes to its use with a long history of biases and prejudices and standards that have changed. So we've seen many cases of machine learning systems going wrong, denigrating particular racial groups, being applied, for example, in bail assessment and having a sort of a racial bias against them. We've seen from the natural language domain systems. I love this particular one where someone showed that in a particular machine translation example, you could go from Turkish that doesn't have gendered nouns and translate it into a language with gendered nouns, and it would translate doctor as male and nurse as female and so on. That wasn't an unbearable thing as well, because obviously you have kind of humans to make sure that stuff works properly. But that kind of bias is systemic because we're learning from the experience that we've had previously. And so the problem that I see in machine learning is that if you simply throw data at it, it's going to learn about the society that we had, not the society that we want to have. Homosexuality was for a long time classified as a mental disorder, until quite recently. Now, what's good news in this space is that a lot of people have recognized this, and so there's now really great work happening at the Turing Institute and the Centre for the Future of Intelligence, both in the UK and by AI Now in the US. And these are often scientists who are identifying the problem, formalizing what the problem is, coming up with methods to often resolve this at quite a deep and mathematical way. We haven't solved the problem because it's not solved in of itself by having some great maths or having awareness about it. We have to do more than that. But if we don't solve it, the problem is that everything that we do is going to be is interfaced through devices, and these devices will have machine learning behind them. So these things will literally be baked into our systems. Where I'm a little bit less optimistic is that many of the decisions that get made by product managers who are living the practicality of having to ship software, and so they're going to take shortcuts. And so long as we are chasing growth or chasing the next KPI or OKR or whatever it is, my temptation to, as a product manager, just to throw out that check because it's only going to affect that lot of people, is pretty high. And this is what we've seen with notifications on the smartphone, where every product manager has read Lean Startup and knows they have an Andrew Chen, right? They know they've got to get retention, so they throw in a notification loop, and now I'm getting 7,000 notifications a day. There's a tragedy of the commons emerging there. So I think we're doing some great work around ethics and AI and responsible AI. People are aware of the issues. Cathy O'Neill's book was very important for this, and there's now much more formal work being done in good ways that is being funded, that is helping us come up with formal methods. The reality is these products are completely unregulated and anyone can produce them. Technology's been proliferated, and do the people who are at the front line have any incentive to slow down their rate of development in order to kind of tick a box, which might be how they think about it? I'm not sure. So I think we have more work to do there, but more positive about this than I was 2 years ago.
So what's coming up for you? Like, what are you looking forward to in 2018?
Well, in 2018, Exponential View will be 3 years old, and I would like to get to a milestone audience. So if I can get to 50,000 next year, which is kind of double where we are today, that would be great. I really want to develop the ideas around the convergence of these different strands of technology. And we didn't talk about Earth observation satellites or lithium-ion batteries or genome sequencing. I'd like to come up with a framework that lasts a bit longer to help us think through what these actually mean and how we can participate to make sure the outcomes are positive for all of us.